Another session. I want to thank all y'all who joined, thank the students who were out there doing what they did. Thank those of you who joined to support the students. And I just would encourage the students, as I hope this whole symposium is encouraging them, and as I hope my classes and other things we do here encourage you, that you keep pushing and keep struggling. It's the only way you bring change about. So, I'm not a Texan. Shocking, I know. But when I arrived in Texas the first time to attend that little school down the road in Austin, I quickly learned about how y'all are about Texas, Texans are about Texas, and it's a thing. It's a thing. So our next speaker is both a thing and a Texan, as I will talk about in just a minute. From Buda, nonetheless, so just a little farther down the road than Austin, but not a whole lot. Our next speaker is Boston-based, where, as I discovered looking around, he is proudly claimed by Tufts University, an artist, a writer, and organizer whose commitments to documenting and supporting artists and communities of color is frankly inspiring. Deeply engaged with collaborative practices, he seeks, explores, and uses intercultural contact and historical narratives in order to generate reparative counter-images and social transformation. His recent projects and performances have been featured at the Bennis Center for Contemporary Arts in Omaha, at the Blue Star Contemporary in San Antonio, the Institute of Contemporary Art in Boston, and the Mountain Standard Time Performative Art Biennial in Calgary, Canada. Publications include The Social Practice That Is Race, co-authored with Dan Wang, an exhibition catalog he edited, Organize Your Own, The Politics and Poetics of Self-Determination Movements, and his most recent work, which just looks amazing, a co-edited volume, Last Gaspism, Art and Survival in the Age of the Pandemic, which I know we can all use. It's a collection of interviews, critical essays, and artist portfolios that consider matters of life and death having to do with breath, both allegorical and literal, in the context of compounding ecological, political, public health, and spiritual crises of our time. A co-founder of the Latinx Artist Visibility Award, a national scholarship for Latinx artists produced in collaboration with the artist Jay Soto and the Oxbow School of Art, and a co-founder of the Latinx Artist Retreat, a national gathering of Latinx artists and administrators. Please join me in welcoming Anthony Romero.
Hi, thank you all for coming. Thank you to our incredible hosts who've been so kind and generous, supporting us with all the logistics and food and accommodations. I'm appreciative of that. Thank you to the other incredible speakers, the symposium. It's really been amazing to witness all of your work, and I'm incredibly privileged to do so. To the students, I had a nice opportunity to meet some of the students and to visit the protest action that happened. How many folks in this room were there at the protest? Wow. We have a round of applause? Round of applause for yourselves. We were talking a little bit about this in the back. You know, I think often it can be difficult to understand how institutions like a university might operate. But you as students, I say this to my students all the time, you as students are in a greater position to advocate and to leverage and to pressure than the university than faculty. So for that, I want to encourage you. And I want to say, take your time and take care of each other because you'll need each other. And take care of each other because the institution won't take care of you. That's true now. That's why mutual aid exists. So make sure you take care of each other, stay hydrated, take breaks when you need breaks. You know, you can follow that old Marxist adage, from each according to their ability, to each according to their needs. You know, we all have gifts to offer movements. It's part of what you'll learn in this journey now. So step up when you're ready to step up and step back. because the fight will be long. It's always longer than you think it is. And the institution will try to wait it out. Because the other thing about being a student activist is that institutions like to think that you cycle through, right? There were some great remarks that pointed to just 7 years ago at another Brown Symposium when a similar action was taking place. That's the cycle of how power operates within these institutions. They want to wait you out because they think, well, you'll only be here 4 or 5 years if we give it enough time. So, take care of each other. The fight will be long, but if you stay committed, you'll succeed. So I have a very distinct pleasure in being here because this is my home. It's also my ancestral home. It's my homelands. I'll talk a little bit more about this shortly, but my family's indigenous to the Texas-Mexico border. And there's something that is incredibly powerful in being in this space, especially when so many of my relatives have never been in spaces like that, like maybe like some, well, I'll pose it as a question. Are there any first-gen students in the room? Shout out first-gen students, round of applause. I'm also a first-generation student. I come from migrant farmers and dairy workers and the like, and you know, my grandparents never learned to read, neither of my grandfathers could learn how to read. And I somehow managed to not only go to college, but to become a college professor. So shout out all first-gen students. This shit is super hard. But you'll succeed. But you also don't have to carry the world on your back. You know, that's something that took me many, many years to understand, right? That all these generational sacrifices that were made that allows you to occupy this room, to be in these predominantly white institutions that were never made for you, that were never made to accommodate anyone like you, you don't have to carry that all on your back. So that's important, you know? Find moments for joy, find moments for rest, find your people. So I typically like to begin my talks with a land acknowledgement. As many of you may know, land acknowledgements have become more and more prevalent in institutional settings, where they exist primarily as a practice of acknowledging colonialism and the injustices that have been committed against indigenous peoples as a result of settlement and ensuing social, cultural, and political genocide. Today, however, I would like to follow indigenous scholar Dylan Robinson, who encourages to remember that an acknowledgement of injustice is not the same as repair. Just to echo some of the conversation earlier today, that there is always that trap of conflating repair with an acknowledgement of injustice. And we want to be sure that we're avoiding it at all costs. So while acknowledging injustices may in many cases be an important step towards reparations, we should be mindful of the steps that follow our good intentions. If acknowledging injustice announces our good intentions, right, is a way of framing what comes next, then the steps we take after that move us closer to repair through good actions in the building or rebuilding of good relations. So, as I said, I was born and raised here on Cuauhtecan land. My family's indigenous to this place. It's land that we share with Lapanapachi, Eshtakna, Koronkoa, Jumano, numerous other family bands and tribal groups. It's land that also sits at a crossroads. As anthropologists would say, it was a nexus of trade routes and migratory routes that connects parts of Central America and Mexico to the southwest and farther north. This history lives in excess to anthropology, though. It is carried in the stories of folks like a dear Nipmuc artist and activist and friend, Kristen Wyman, who tells me the story of how corn came from my people to hers while visiting land that she was rematriating in central Massachusetts. As I said, I grew up brown and working class, surrounded by ranches, dairy farms, and cotton fields in the hill country. The same cotton fields that my parents worked in as children to buy school supplies for themselves and their siblings. A reality that my parents encouraged me to remember as I moved through institutions like this one and the one that I currently work at. But more specifically, just to reflect maybe some other experiences in the room, a few years back, I got a fellowship at Harvard. I was very excited about this, and I called my mother. And instead of congratulating me on the fellowship at Harvard, she began to tell me about working in the fields at 7 and 8 years old to buy school supplies for her siblings. So that's some of that weight talking about before. But my talk today is dedicated to my great-grandparents, my grandparents and family who never had the opportunity to be in spaces like this, to learn, to exchange, to tell their stories, share their wisdom to a broad public. This work is dedicated to my relatives, collaborators, thought partners, and elders who speak with and through me, who help shape my thoughts and by turn my experiences in the world. I don't do this alone. My talk is dedicated to my parents who ensure that I never forget how much has been lost and gained in one generation. This is my paternal great-grandfather who was a sharecropper in Niederwald. My gratitude extends to the land, waters, and other than human kin who also call these lands home. May this gratitude be followed always by good thought, good action, and good relation. Hene Yahweh. My talk today is part of a larger developing body of research that I've been loosely referring to as the place where the creek goes underground, and is at the moment an opportunity to visit with Indigenous artists and scholars, to hear how they incorporate their own traditional worldviews and practices into the art making and research. It's a project that was initiated by a commitment I made during the pandemic to cultural resurgence for my own community, a commitment that has found its way by learning the traditional medicine of my mother and her mother, Curanderismo, which is what I'll talk about shortly. But I'm getting a little bit ahead of myself. My mother retired just a few months before the onset of the global 19 pandemic. My mother had for several decades worked at a child care center at our local high school, Hayes High School. With some Hayes folks in here? Shout out Hayes. A surprisingly progressive program. I never thought I would say that. Our surprisingly progressive I was just saying, you know, you grow up brown and working class in the borderlands and you can't wait to get out. And then you get out and you're like, oh shit, I need to go back. Just give you a view of what happens decades later. But so my mother worked at the child care center at our high school, a surprisingly progressive program by Texas standards that provides teen mothers with on-site child care services while they finish out their high school careers. My mother, as I said, is a cunadera, as was her mother. And for those unfamiliar, curanderismo is a generic term used to describe the traditional healing practices of Mexican and Mexican-American communities. Folks, raise your hand if you're familiar with curanderismo. Anybody had an egg rubbed on them? That's probably the easiest way to know. If you had an egg rubbed on you, you could raise your hand. That's the most common sign. In academic circles, curanderismo is described as a hybrid religious and medicinal practice that expresses the entanglement of European belief systems, Christianity, namely, but more specifically, Catholicism, West African traditions, which were introduced through the slave trade, and the indigenous belief systems of Mayan, Mexican, or Aztec, and Native American communities pre- and post-contact. A detailed analysis of the literature on that is outside of the scope of my conversation today, but I'm happy to share references to folks if you're interested. But it should be noted, this is what's important about how academia works in regards to our histories, is that typically in academic circles, the European influence tends to be outsized. Probably no surprise. Which is to say, right, that the traditional practice is really born out of the, like let's say within Texas, where we are now, between Texas and Mexico, is really born out of intercultural exchange, as we said. This is a nexus of trade and migration, and the medicine reflects that. But often what you find in the literature is a real centering of European belief systems within that structure and a denigration of native or indigenous beliefs within the system. And the effect, as you might expect, erases the rich intercultural exchange between indigenous communities throughout the borderlands, as well as West African influences, which really just prevents us from understanding a deeper history of how enslaved peoples from West Africa and indigenous peoples from this place interacted with each other and produced culture and community and sociality and medicine. Curanderismo, already did that. Curanderismo broadly covers plant medicine. So this is everything that's contained within the practice. Well, not everything, but what I'm willing to put here. Plant medicine, limpias, or spiritual cleansings, dream work, body work, ceremonies of various kinds, as well as counseling. So if you had that egg rubbed on you, this would be a limpia. Specifics are unique to region, individuals, and even families. My mother, for example, was gifted with sight, or what we might refer to in Western terms as intuition, and had a natural proclivity towards limpias of various kinds. That was really her bread and butter. My grandmother, on the other hand, worked through her dreams and held knowledge now lost, such as the prayers used to move storms. At the start of the pandemic, as my mother's retirement dreams came grinding to a halt, as many of our dreams did, I began to develop a project that would engage her, our traditions, and our relatives. I began by asking her questions, encouraging her to write down what she could remember of her mother's medicine, stories, and prayers from the señoras that are no longer with us. I sent her articles and videos on curanderismo and asked her how accurate she thought they were. Is that kind of literature review made in relation to each other and measured by its accuracy to our life. It was through this collaboration with my mother that I came to know Abuelita, Marica Alvarado, who's a Lapon Apache elder and medicine woman, that I've had the good fortune to study with for the last few years. And it's been through this learning and relearning that I began to not only reclaim our traditions, but to censure them in my research and in my artistic practice. It was this investment, oh, some of my slides are missing. That's okay. It was this investment in our cultural resurgence that led to the development of the research project that I call The Place Where the Creek Goes Underground. For a few years now, I've been meeting with indigenous scholars, artists, and organizers to hear their stories, to share space, to visit, to learn how they incorporate their traditional worldviews into their work. I ask questions like, what is the shape of your practice? And they respond by drawing ceremonial shapes or by telling me a story. One of those stories comes from Roberto Bedoya, cultural affairs manager for the city of Oakland, and a Chicano, self-identified. His story goes like this. In every city or town, or almost every, there is a creek. In every creek, there is a place where it goes underground. That place may still be accessible, or it may be paved over. It may be a parking lot, or a hospital, a set of condos. Somewhere in that city or town, there is someone who remembers this place, the place where the creek goes underground. My work, meaning Roberto's work, but perhaps it's better for us to say our work. My work then is to make the knowledge available to the broadest public possible and to facilitate opportunities to showcase this kind of place knowing. What I appreciate about Roberto's story is that it is an exercise in indigenous pedagogy, which is to say that I believe the story to be as much about the creek, all our creeks, and the lessons of that creek as it continues to flow, with or without our ability to perceive it. That's a lesson in the spirit of the water that wants to keep moving. It's medicine and the extent to which we can access it or are prepared to do what is necessary in order to access it. But the story is also about the systems and structures that prevent knowledge, in this case, place-based knowledge, from being produced and transferred or shared. And here we might even see a mirroring of the paving over of the creek that Roberto mentions as a reflection of the paving over of land-based knowledge, an important lesson, an important observation, as there's much to be said about how erasing the land affects indigenous knowledge and lifeways both of which are part of the land or are the land. Additionally, we can add that the story is also about how knowledge becomes public, a concern that is bound up in the discourses of contemporary art, public art, and art and activism in particular ways. But before we go any further, it's important for us to take a moment and define our terms a bit more. Discussions, okay, so you would have seen a slide that said Latinx, Brown, Indigenous. It like laid over an image of West Texas, like a really beautiful, idyllic image of the desert. So, okay. Discussions of contemporary Latinx art are often burdened with defining the peoples, histories, and practices that compose the broad spectrum of communities and concerns that are bundled together in the term Latinx. A relatively recent term, Latinx emerges as an acknowledgement of the limitations of Latina, Latino, Latinat, Latine, and the like. Just keep going and going. At this point, it's like these conversations with my students, they become like rehearsals, you know? I was just having this conversation with a student of mine from El Salvador, whether or not it should be Latinx or Latine. Anyway, while a detailed history and analysis of the term Latinx is also beyond the scope of this paper, as a Brown artist and organizer, what is generative for me in these conversations of how to name, articulate, and theorize public and private configurations of Brown experience is the application of these theories through a practice of Latinx politics that expresses itself in acts of inclusion and refusal. And here we might also consider the where and how of hemispheric indigeneity, right? So how does histories of colonialism, histories of indigeneity also impact those identity formations across the hemisphere as it expresses itself in the everyday experience of our communities, right? So there, the egg again, rubbing on your head. Examples of this include indigenous words or phrases that have been incorporated into Spanish and English, foods and food ways, tamal, tamali, etc. Farming practices, healing practices, worldviews, stories, La Llorona, that's a good example. I would encourage you to read the original story of La Llorona, which is about an indigenous woman who had her baby taken away. But content warning, it's not a happy story. Belief systems and many more aspects of our lives. The political potential of the term Latinx lies across the intersecting lines of the X that interrupt and punctuate Latin America, the Latin and Latinx. Refusing to gender itself, the X is neither O or A, as either would define the term by the gendered grammatical rules of the Spanish language, which has come to symbolize the fact of historical and present colonization, dispossession, and subjugation. So it was always a point of contention in my family's house. So for folks of my generation, our parents went to school during English-only laws. So they often had Spanish language, beaten out of them, run the risk of being expelled. All manner of violence might be placed on them for not just speaking Spanish, but for having an accent in general. So as a result, many folks of my generation didn't learn to speak Spanish. My father's position on this was that it wasn't our language to begin with, so what difference did it make? Ni de aquí ni de allá, neither from here nor there, is one way scholars have defined the significance of the term as it alerts us to displacements of various scales as the precondition for the social-political realities of so-called Latinx peoples. But this too was problematized by indigeneity, as indigenous experience is inherently about land and place. It is quite literally implaced. Ni de aquí ni de allá may accurately describe what it feels like to be displaced or dispossessed of place, but it does so at the expense of our ancestral connections to particular lands. This slippage of geographies and identities is precisely what Latinx is meant to describe and enact, if only symbolically and performatively. To make a practice of this kind of slippage is to mobilize identitarian rhetoric in order to center hemispheric entanglements, right? All these histories and traditions and cultures and beliefs are all knotted together across the hemisphere, right? This is the entanglement. While working towards securing greater representation and the reallocation of resources, right? So that's really the Latinx project. In order to gain political mobility, one argument is that in order to gain political mobility, you need to create a cohesive group. In movement building, we refer to that as coalition building. But in academic circles, often what we find is there's a homogenizing effect, right? That all of these things become the same, but they do so in order to advocate and make an argument for a particular group of people. Latinx is a political project, an effort to create commonality, sometimes inventing communion, for the purposes of advocating on behalf of our communities. It is because Latinx as a political project is bound up in the shifting social and material conditions of brown peoples of this hemisphere that I am invested in looking for ever better ways of describing what Jose Esteban Munoz referred to as feeling brown. Or we might think of here as the difference felt or sensed that evades linguistic categorization, right? So that way that we know that we're brown, even if we can't quite articulate how or why. I also want to expand that kind of sensorial way of understanding one's brownness as a way to sidestep colorism, right? It's because Latinx as a political project, this difference nests between and through racialized, gendered, sexualized, and classed experiences across the shifting hemispheric context, and for this reason has never easily been described by terms like Latinx. The purpose of making the distinction between brown as an identity on the move and Latinx as a political project, not exclusive to brown, as we all know we can have white Latinxes, is to speak with ever more clarity about methodologies and goals of what is typically called contemporary Latinx art and activism. Given that both terms, Latinx and brownness, are entangled in hemispheric and global histories of conquest, extraction, dispossession, and the like, clarity and specificity are important because they allow us to orient ourselves amidst these entanglements in pursuit of identifying moments within brown art worlds in which the very act of feeling brown, of making space for a brown commons, constitute a unique form of political feeling and activism. Following Munoz, we may consider, in the time we have today, the ways in which the precondition of displacement, dislocation, dispossession have proven formative in the development of practices of brown and indigenous art and activism, where brown and indigenous becomes aspects of a uniquely Latinx experience across borderlands, including the coastal and northern borders. That's where I live in New England. Side note, just to give an example. So I moved away I went to Texas State for my undergrad, and I moved away to go to Chicago from graduate school. And this was like an exceptionally big deal because no one ever moved away. Nobody went to college, but also no one ever left. So it was a huge deal. And it took probably my entire undergraduate career to negotiate this with my mother. And so when I finally was going to leave, my mother said, well, you need to have cleansing. And so the day I was going to get on the plane, she woke me up at 4 o'clock in the morning, and we drove into South Austin. And she took me to see the señora that worked at this laundromat in South Austin. The laundromat wasn't open yet, but my mother got there, and she knocked on the door, and this older woman came out, and they opened the door. Her and my mother have a conversation in Spanish, which I could only sort of half follow. My mother gives her some groceries. That's often what my mother would do. She would kind of exchange services with food, most often. And then the señora takes me into the break room of the laundromat. So I'm standing in the break room of the laundromat, you know, like puppy dog calendar on the wall, microwave, mini fridge. And she starts praying over me, and she takes a bundle of plants, and she brushes me with the plants, and then she lights the copal, and she's blowing smoke over me, and that. Feeling brown, you know, that thing. Where our experience, while it may be dislocated, while it may be dispossessed of its context, right? In this case, we may have done that in a more ceremonial way had there not been capitalism and sexism and colonialism and white supremacy and all that stuff. Like, we may have done that in a different way at another time, but we still did it. And we fit it into the nooks and crannies of our lives. We always do that. And that's part of it too. So while dislocation itself is not grounds for belonging, the space that opens up for us when pinned between here and there is one in which a feeling or sense of brown emerges. It is from these unnameable but recognizable sets of affects, sensations, pre-linguistic sensations, another way to think of that, that we can begin to build networks of care, kinship, community, and solidarity. Implicit in this argument is an insistence on viewing art and activism from a critical race perspective. Often absent in the discussions of art and activism, political art, socially engaged art, all the ways you might encounter this in your classrooms, is the recognition that because views on race condition our social and political lives, they therefore also shape not just how art and culture are made, but how we receive and interpret it. This is especially important in discussions of the work of Black, Brown, Indigenous artists, activists of color, who are specifically working in related communities, and encourages us to ask the question, how do we cultivate a model of critical insight and reflection that allows us to feel through this work and not reduce it to aesthetic legitimacy, measurable outcomes, or other racially biased forms of critical engagement and understanding? What Munoz encourages us to feel, to sense, is the incompleteness of Brown, the not yet, an acknowledgement of the nimbleness, agency, and flexibility of a people who are rendered brown by their personal and familial participation in south to north migration patterns. In this way, Munoz elaborates on theorizations of Latinx that position Latinx as a future-making effort, a theory and mode of being that is defined by being on the move or being between here and there. Elaborating on Munoz, I would add, for those of us who are descendant from migratory bands of indigenous peoples, like myself, like some of you in this room, peoples who practiced what I refer to as a sovereignty on the move. Migration, free movement, was not a matter of giving up one's claim to a place, as it is sometimes misunderstood in conservative circles. One can move freely and still practice self-determination in relationship to a place, if for no other reason than free movement is a human right, not exclusive to territorial claims or property. We find ourselves now butting up against the old settler argument that indigenous peoples do not use the land properly, and for that reason are not fit to hold title to it. It's also a very common logic in gentrification too, right? That is like, properties are not used well, therefore we must X, Y, and Z. In the context of contemporary debates over immigration rights, Black, Brown, and Indigenous peoples are thrusted into circumstances where they cannot stay in place because of abuses, violence, lack of water, climate change, toxic extractive industries, and so on, but are prevented from leaving by xenophobic immigration laws and policies. Neither here nor there, right? That's the true violence of how global capitalism, white supremacy, settler colonialism, all those structures work, right? Creates the conditions in which a place is no longer habitable, but it prevents you from leaving. Criminalizes you for wanting to leave. Or for needing to leave, because maybe you don't want to. Munoz takes this sense of movement and articulates it in relationship to ideas of futurity and refusal in order to activate a sense of commonality that is not defined by Latinness at all or proximity to Latin America, but rather by an ability to flourish under duress and pressure. And here we find kinship between what Munoz is trying to do in Latinx studies and what Black scholars have been doing for a long time, which is to articulate the ways in which Black, Brown, and Indigenous peoples, despite being in free fall, managed to produce a beautiful world, right? And managed to produce futures for themselves, managed to find love, managed to find joy, managed to produce robust cultures, Um, this quote's been up here for a while, so I won't read it because of time. But eschewing the slippery slopes of nationalism and cultural authenticity, Munoz insists that we attune ourselves to that sense of Brown that emerges from being in common with each other. From indigenous perspective, we can map this being in common onto what is often referred to as relation, or the consensual, intimate, and reciprocal relationships that are built between peoples, lands, water, and non-human kin. The implication here is that Brown is not only what we do, it is not only an embodied reality performed at different and occasionally competing scales. It's not only all of those things, but is itself a practice of political feeling and refusal. It is a practice insofar as what is required to be Brown, not just rendered Brown, not just an image, but a living and breathing Brown body, must be attended to regularly over time. So this is one way that we can define a practice, right? A practice is that which we attend to regularly over time. So already we have a sense of discipline and duration. Spiritual practice, it's that thing you do regularly over time. You go to church every Sunday, you say your prayers in the morning, whatever, right? A medical practice, so that attention is what becomes important. So for that, feeling of Brown. It's not simply that Brown is a construction, right? That it's a way that we are able to put language to a certain kind of identity. In the same way that Latinx is a construct aimed at political mobility, right? Like Latinx doesn't necessarily mean anything, but it means all these things. But because Brown is a construction, it allows us to remodel and remake ourselves and each other. This is how we not only find ourselves in the Brown Commons, but how we find each other, right? And that's important for that solidarity building, you know? Like both what I'm talking about here, but also what happened out there. That's the Commons. This is how we not only found ourselves, we keep moving, we stay on the move. And because, as activist and scholar Debbie Goulds has pointed out, the movement in social movements gestures towards the realm of affect, bodily intensities, emotions, feelings, and passions, and towards uprisings. This sense of Brown itself, a kind of political feeling that emerges from being in common, from being in good relation with each other, is foundational for understanding Latinx as it interlaces Black, Brown, and Indigenous experiences, right? Because that's actually what's important. So when we start to build those kinds of identities around cultural authenticity and nationhood or language or those things, right? What we start to do is we start to subdivide populations, and then we find ourselves falling into anti-Black pitfalls or anti-Indigenous pitfalls, right? When if we're able to relate to each other through that sense of being in common, of being Brown together, then something else can emerge. Something which hopefully allows us to bring our whole self to that space. To put it another way, being in common suggests a mode of not just being, but of finding ourselves in and through our relations with each other. This is how I come to know myself. I come to know myself by being in relation to all of you. And for this reason is an indigenous expression of life, especially as it implies a set of ethics from which relationships might be built. To practice being in common with each other is not meant to empower ourselves by eschewing conflict or to suggest that finding each other in brownness is somehow easy to do because we are so much alike. But rather, as Munoz reminds us, to be Brown is in part to be in struggle. Being Brown is to be in conflict, and that includes with each other. We engage in, as Robin D.G. Kelley has said of the work of building solidarity, the constant struggle to create community. Kelly continues, and creating community means creating community with those you don't like, and people who don't like you, and trying to figure out how to move forward to something better. Not to the point of, as King would put it, sentimental love, but a hard love that's in struggle. And again, just to bring us back to a little while ago, that hard love was on full display in the Commons earlier. What we bring to this process as artists is a set of conceptual and material practices that allow us to engage in a prolonged struggle in ways that are nourishing, cathartic, communal, beautiful, joyous, and sustainable. So at this point in my talk, if you need to fidget, if you need to stand up, if you need to switch seats, if you need to do things like that, please feel free. You know, this would ordinarily be my nap time. So like, I feel you right now. You know, let's just like take a couple minutes. If you need to like check your phone because you're like, I can't look at a human anymore, that's cool too. Let's just do that. And we'll give ourselves just a couple minutes to just kind of like let the feels out. You're welcome. I know, you can't hold the attention, you know. We have time. $3:30, right? 3:15? Okay. 3:30? $3:15. So I'll start again in one more minute. If your homies are outside, just shoot them a text. If they want to come back, I mean. I don't know. There's cookies after this. All right, ready, reassembled, moved our bodies, stared at our phones, checked all those reels you didn't know was happening. So we have about a half hour left, I'm told. I'll say a few more things and then we'll open it up for conversation. When we speak of art, we are often speaking of materials and forms. Whether we are speaking to students in a classroom, to each other, to participants in a workshop, or during an artist talk, like this one, the discourses of materiality and formalism are important components for communicating about artistic intention and understanding how meaning is produced through acts of making and witnessing. Most often, when we speak of materials and forms, we are speaking of normative modes of artistic production and medium specificity. Which is just a professorial way of saying that sometimes the materials are paint and canvas, and the form is the picture, and sometimes the materials are heat and clay, and the form is the vessel or pot. In my artistic practice, as well as in my research and thinking, it's been useful to expand this notion to stretch these discourses around our lived experiences, social lives, cultural practices, and relationships to place and land. This expansive thinking allows us to consider how urban planning and public policy, for example, operate as materials that allow a city to take shape or form. It allows us to incorporate cultural values, social norms, and ideologies into our thinking and practices by understanding how ideas get embedded in materials and, as a result, influence forms or are concretized by forms. The great abolitionist scholar Ruth Wilson Gilmore has noted, capitalism requires inequality, and racism enshrines that inequality. Also may be useful for the movement building happening on campus now. So capitalism requires inequality and racism enshrines that inequality. Following the logic here, we may begin to wonder if we can identify how this idea is embedded in materials that shape our experience of the world. Does that allow us to open a line of inquiry in order to see how predatory loaning practices, redlining, and other segregated housing practices are the materials through which inequality gets shaped in the city? Ethnic enclaves and segregated neighborhoods do not merely appear, but are the formal consequence of specific material decisions. Material decisions that are themselves expressions of ideas. As an artist and an educator, this kind of thinking is important to me because it enables us to build upon the imaginative potential of artistic production by reframing the development of creative skills, teaching and learning about art, and artistic practice as the means by which we not only imagine alternative worlds, but build them. Or as I sometimes say, art is the means by which we both imagine and enact simultaneously alternatives to dominant schemas of power. Similarly, within the classroom, this reframing allows us to see the development of visual literacies, so all the stuff that you're learning here, as essential components for understanding how the world is shaped and reshaped conceptually and materially all the time. And I would add, your agency within that reshaping, right? Moments for you to intervene, to make new and better shapes for yourselves and for your loved ones. So I have an example of this that I'll go through somewhat quickly. In March of 2020, as I began investing and learning our traditional medicine, clearly the pandemic was a very busy time for me, like juggling all this stuff with my mom, and our kid didn't have school, so we made a school in our house and had a bunch of 3-year-olds running around all the time. That's a story for another time. I joined, spoiler alert, it sucked. I joined a small cohort of artists who were invited to be Boston Artists in Residence. Developed and coordinated by the Mayor's Office of Arts and Culture, the Boston Artists in Residency program fosters collaboration between artists and city departments as selected artists develop public artworks. What that means is that invited artists are embedded within different city department and agencies and essentially become staff members and collaboratively develop with staff in the Mayor's Office projects. Those projects can look like anything from white papers to expressions of data points to murals. For my part, I was placed with the Mayor's Office of Immigrant Advancement. It should come as no surprise that being embedded within City Hall at the start of a global pandemic, during a year of resurgent social movements, shaped not only my experience of the residency, but also reshaped my thinking and practice in profound ways. Much of those first few weeks and early months were spent making sense of the data that my Moya collaborators were sharing with me. And it was clear from the start that the economic, social, and health impacts of the emerging global pandemic were hitting Boston's immigrant communities, and especially immigrant communities of color, in catastrophic ways. So 3 years into the pandemic, it has become common knowledge that inequality was an essential component of understanding the pandemic experience. But just to give you a sense of how that lives in people's homes, is that Boston has a really robust Haitian community. They're one of the largest immigrant populations. The vast majority of Haitian immigrants work in home health care. And I mean vast majority, I mean 90% of them work in home health care. So you take this exceptionally large immigrant population, all of whom were at great risk because they're working in home health care during the pandemic, an essential position, most of the time contract work with not enough benefits to support them if they were going to be sick. And then you add cultural norms on top of that, such as many of you may already know or experience now, many immigrant communities, many communities of color in general, live in multi-generational homes. So we already live in higher density domestic units than other populations, which of course would just put us at greater risk during the pandemic. While the prevailing narrative about Boston is as a predominantly white city, the truth of the matter is that Boston ceased being a majority white city in 2017. Since the 1990s, Boston's population has grown exponentially, with most new residents being foreign-born. Of the roughly 530,000 people who moved to the city between 1990 and 2017, 480 were immigrants of color. Despite these shifting demographics, Boston remains a deeply segregated city. In fact, Boston has proved integral in the development and proliferation of deeply racist housing practices since at least the 1800s. Further back, if we count the colonial periods and things like prayer towns, which were segregated housing developments for indigenous and freed, formerly enslaved folks, contingent upon them converting, all of them converting to Christianity. From exclusionary development to systemic barriers to home ownership, redlining, racist and predatory loaning practices, etc., and staggering economic inequality, Boston has long nurtured a persistent housing crisis for BIPOC communities. As demographics in the city change, the enduring housing crisis has been inherited by immigrant communities of color. I would wager, I haven't looked at any of the data, but I would wager the same is true here, just anecdotally from conversations with folks. It's important to remember that although the current housing and eviction crisis in Boston has been catalyzed by the destabilizing effects of the pandemic, what we are witnessing on the ground is the result of decades-long policy and planning decisions. So I mentioned this to folks before, but often the adage around understanding gentrification is by the time you can see gentrification, it's already too late. Because all the zoning laws, all the urban planning policies, all the stuff that needed to be in place to enable that transfer of ownership happened decades before and out of sight of the public. In June of 2020, the Boston Globe and other local news outlets were estimating upwards of 120,000 residents, households in Boston at risk of eviction. That number actually would climb during that year to nearly 250,000 households. state and federal moratoriums on evictions in place until mid-2020 offered little relief for undocumented and BIPOC immigrant residents who are already experiencing bullying and intimidation from landlords attempting to circumvent the moratorium by using extra legal tactics. It's a complicated way to say that landlords were doing some really fucked up shit, excuse my language, in which they were trying to, it just heated, in which they were threatening to call ICE on folks, they were harassing them or trying to call the cops, all kinds of bad things. So, what did I do? Working with the insights gained through Moya's data on the impact of the pandemic on Boston's immigrant communities, and leaning into relationships I previously established as part of a project I'd been commissioned to create by the Institute of Contemporary Art in Boston as part of an exhibition on immigration, I began working on what would become Boston Housing Support Stations. Boston Housing Support Stations was a coalition-driven project that responded to the enduring housing crisis in Boston by providing housing insecure residents with the technological access and legal knowledge necessary to defend against eviction and remain housed. So what does that mean? It means that housing court went online. It means that immigration court went online. It means that as rental assistance programs were being unveiled by the State Department and the federal government, that they were being, especially at the state level, they were being rolled out in English first, and then other languages followed suit, sometimes a month later. So already you see disadvantage being designed into the system, right? So we provide people with technology, laptops, iPads, things like that. And we give them access to legal advocates and law students. So situated in East Boston, a neighborhood with a large immigrant population, mostly Central American, though not only, lots of North African folks. We built physical computer stations to give residents access to essential technology as they filled out rental relief applications and court documents, as well as an intake system and network of volunteers who offer expertise, law students and legal advocates, as I said, administrative support, mutual aid volunteers. I took my whole budget for creating a public artwork and dumped it into mutual aid organization in the neighborhood. Language support, mutual aid organizers, but also some of my students at the university were also volunteering to do interpretation services and support people filling out these applications. As you might imagine, when the applications eventually did come in to languages that were accessible to folks, the sheer bureaucracy of it was completely overwhelming. So it's hard for people to get through the paperwork. It's very, as some of you may know, but if you don't know, is time consuming to be poor. You might not know if you didn't live that life, but you spend a lot of time in government offices and federal buildings waiting and waiting and waiting for shit to happen, and it's very hard to understand, and it wastes all your time. That's just a side note. Core organizers on the project, I'm trying to be quick, but I need to name everybody. Include myself, Dan Jackson, and Jules Rousseau-Sievert of the New Law Lab, an interdisciplinary legal design laboratory housed at the Northeastern University of Law. In general, for folks who are interested in law school, Northeastern School of Law has lots of social justice centered labs and what are they called? Clinics, thank you. Knew I should have taken a nap. Rita Lara and Kaylee Aguilar of Maverick Landing Community Services, that's our HQ, as well as artists and community organizers. Gabriela Cartagena is a wonderful Salvadorian organizer and artist. So at the start of my residency with the city, during onset of the pandemic, amidst a swift rearrangement of our lives, all the things that we've come to live with so comfortably, I wrestled with what it meant to be making public art without a public, right? Not to mention like the place of art amidst all of that, but that's like, we save that for later. Over time, the question evolved though, and reframed itself in relationship to the development of the Boston Housing Support Station and the coalition that drives it, such that I began to ask, of what use is public art if we are not working towards community stabilization, resiliency, and liberation? This is true for me of art in general now. I can say more about that, but I'll wait. From my perspective, as an artist amongst lawyers, community organizers, advocates, and administrators, the work we are doing through the Boston Housing Support Stations is less concerned with questions of aesthetic value or the symbolic potential of political action, but is rather an exercise in the artful practice of resource redistribution. It is a form of infrastructural activism, which is to say it is an artwork which not only builds infrastructure, but builds it in such a way that intervenes into dominant infrastructure in order to produce another world, let's say. This is not to say that our work did not or does not include normative modes of artistic production, paintings, drawings, photography, sculpture, that kind of stuff, but rather to be engaged in movement work, as the Boston Housing Support Station is a part of the housing justice movement in the city and across the country. To be involved in movement work is itself an artistic endeavor, insofar as political work is an imaginative and world-building project. By situating this imaginative practice in relationship to conceptual art and performance, I hope to insist that animating the imagination is not purely speculative, but is the space from which we enact alternative worlds. To put it another way, because performance at its core is about what things do. People, objects, events, etc. It's about what things do, how they act and are acted upon, the effects of those actions, and the ways in which those effects are consolidated to produce impressions or knowledge about the world. Because of all of that, it is the ideal means by which we are able to not only imagine, but to enact alternatives to dominant schemas of power, as I said. Performance theorist Diana Taylor makes a similar point when she notes, the search for justice is a long durational performance. Although the tactics and circumstances change over time, it's the endurance and perseverance that proves efficacious. So, when I was born, my mother planted a tree in the front yard, just outside of my childhood window. The tree is barely alive after being badly damaged in the freezes of the last couple years. Beneath the tree, she planted rosemary. Rosemary is an important medicine for my mother. It's also our namesake. Remedios is the Spanish word for rosemary, in case folks don't know. As a child, my mother would often send me to harvest the rosemary for various treatments. Each time she would say, remember to ask for permission or the medicine won't work. This is the first lesson, consent. Asking for permission is an essential teaching for our community and for many indigenous communities. We ask for permission to be on the land, to share in the gifts of the land and water, the gifts that animal kin and plant kin share with us. And when we ask for permission, we lay down an offering. This is protocol. Typically, the offering would be something like tobacco. But it's important to note that it doesn't have to be tobacco. It can be anything that you have with you. Another plant, say rosemary, or even water. This is important for a few reasons. One, because it shows us that protocols are not rules. They are not doctrine. They are nimble and adaptable. This is how indigenous knowledge has been able to survive. This is how we have been able to survive for millennia. Protocols are about a practice of reciprocity rooted in the ethics of relation. Or as the elders say, we own nothing and we take care of everything. Asking for permission focuses us in our intentions. It pulls us out of ourselves and asks that we consider the desires, the spirit, the consciousness of human and other than human kin. By acknowledging their agency and their being or aliveness. In the simplest of terms, asking for permission is an expression of respect and a recognition of the sovereignty of others, human and other than human. Although it's important to know that the recognition of being, of acknowledging the sovereignty of other bodies, human, plant, land, etc., is distinct from the settler colonial urge to know and to fix others through the gaze, policies of recognition, control, etc. And by fix, I mean surveillance. It's distinct from what Dylan Robinson refers to as the hunger that characterizes the settler desire for knowledge. We see this play out in a number of ways, right? When white folks ask folks of color to reperform our trauma, to reperform the violences, right? Then there's a hunger there to know. In this formulation, knowledge is a resource, one to be extracted and accumulated. It is not propelled by the kind of wonder that characterizes indigenous relationships to knowledge. Even if we visited the same creek 1,000 times, we cannot expect to know the water because it's different every time. We may know the place of the creek, we may know where it goes underground, but we cannot know the water. The cycle of water ensures that each drop is distinct from the one before. This is true even in stillness, because stillness is only movement that can't be perceived by us. For this reason, we lay down our offering every time we approach the creek. Jessica Hernandez in Fresh Banana Leaves, Healing Indigenous Landscapes Through Indigenous Science, reminds us that for many indigenous peoples, our obligation to care for the land is rooted in reciprocal acts of care from the land. Or as Hernandez writes, we care for the land because the land cares for us. To care for that which cares for you requires you to reorient yourself in relationship to others. This reorientation is part of what we do when we lay down our offerings. Because the laying down of an offering is an act of symbolic exchange and a recognition of the network of care that puts human and other than humans into relation with each other, the land, the water, so on. Laying down your offering materializes what our spirits and the spirits of others already know to be true, that our pasts, presents, and futures are bound up in each other. And for that reason, our ability to care for ourselves is bound up in our willingness and capacity to care for others. It is quite literally a matter of life and death. It is also how we started our work in East Boston, by resisting extractive modes of engagement with community members. We started with listening sessions and dinners. We made offerings without expectations. We asked for permission to be there. And in exchange, we offered what we had: money, access, knowledge, time, care. Abuelita reminds us that how we walk on the land is important. We must learn to walk in a good way. And lessons such as these are often like seeds. They are waiting for us to be ready for them. And for that reason, what one gathers from any given lesson may be different each growing season. What I have distilled from these lessons, at least this season, is the importance, the cultural and social necessity of being in a consensual, reciprocal, and intimate relationship with each other and the land. It can be hard to remember these lessons in urban environments. Concrete and pavement have a particular way of dislocating us from the land. Even as environmental policy and progressive urban development attempts to center green space in the city, it does little to restore the network of care, reciprocity, and mutuality that are paramount for so many of our communities. Certainly in a city like Boston, the housing crisis is often met with development plans that do little to address the need for reestablishing traditional foodways and preparation methods, let alone increase the ability of poor, working class, disabled, immigrant, queer, trans, and BIPOC communities to feed themselves in sustainable, healthy, and culturally appropriate ways. As I know from my own childhood and family, and as many of you may know, it's one thing to be poor, and it's quite another to be poor with access to fertile lands. La vivienda es la cura, housing is the cure, has become a protest slogan in the housing justice movement in Boston these last few years. In many images of actions organized by City La Vida Urbana, a longstanding housing justice organization in the city, you can see a beautifully painted banner with the words, La vivienda es la cura. It would seem that even the coastal borderlands of New England, a place immigration attorney Matt Cameron refers to as La Frontera del Norte, the need for los remedios is front and center. Thank you.
Okay, we have time for a couple of questions. I think we have some microphone runners. I'm looking for them. Yes, they're ready. So, questions from y'all?
Where were the photos taken from?
Oh, yeah. Mostly West Texas. See if I can try to remember everything. This is probably like near Alpine. This is like over by Big Bend. That's my mom's house. That's my great-grandpa. That's definitely near Big Bend. I mean, that's like near Big Bend. You know. Let's see, what else we got? Same. This is the border, actually. I think maybe this is by, I think that's near the, I think that's in Big Bend, near the border.
But ours was actually pretty cool, not gonna lie. I mean, I could definitely see what you're saying with that. And and this whole presentation is just amazing, amazing. I mean, in the stories and like the themes too, it's amazing. It's just, and the theme about the evils of capitalism, that's definitely something that's true and sadly still happening with capitalism.
Yeah, for sure. Thank you. I appreciate that.
So first of all, thank you. I really appreciate everything you're saying. I got two things. One, I kept hearing Austin when you said Boston, and let me tell you, the parallels are very strong. The second, I kept thinking, when you're talking about community building, community resilience, and how that might play out in a climate changed world, and how much you've maybe considered the impact of the climate crisis in your own work on mobility and displacement and migration, culturally appropriate foods, access to land, rootedness, access to services, pre and post disaster, like all these things, and how that affects community and how that's being navigated. I hope that question somehow makes sense.
It does. There's layers. So like one layer is that performatively developers, as I just very briefly mentioned, performatively developers might fold in some climate contingency or some green space. In actual practice, in a place like, say, East Boston. So like many places along the coast, a good portion of Boston, including most of East Boston, will be underwater in the next 20 years. It's a big part of the conversation. It's a report that came out like a year or two ago, really staggering numbers and just the stark reality of the impact of rising water on the neighborhood. Now, East Boston, historically an immigrant neighborhood, I'm gonna paint in really broad strokes. Historically an immigrant neighborhood, was the site of an immigration detention center for most of the 19th and into the 20th century, which is why it's an immigrant, it's why it's an immigrant neighborhood. Separated from the rest of the city by a river, which is why most of it will be underwater. Now, that neighborhood has been experiencing rapid gentrification, and I mean like rapid gentrification. Most of that gentrification is happening along the waterfront and is aimed at white-collar, middle-class, mostly workers in tech industries or in related industries that work across the river, but get these beautiful waterfront views, right? Now, we know already, what comes up very often in community groups meetings is like, most of those developments have already flooded. Developers are not beholden to tell future tenants or future owners that the properties have already flooded or even that they exist within a floodway. So it's on each individual to ask the question about the future of that landscape. But we know already they're just siphoning the water out and they're continuing to build. So they're already flooding. We have this 20-year timeline before the thing is submerged. In all likelihood, by the time these places are sold, it's impossible for multiple generations. It would be impossible for multiple generations to live in the house. And we also probably know that it will become harder and harder to insure those homes because insurance companies are certainly looking at those documents, right? So you buy the home, you can't get it insured, 10, 15 years later it's underwater, what are you going to do, But the system is not set up in such a way that there needs to be that they're beholden to any form of transparency around that. That's like one layer. Layer two is a social and cultural layer, which is that often what happens when green space is incorporated into these developments, it's privately owned, publicly accessible green space. So for folks who don't know, what that means is it looks like a park, it smells like a park, but it's run by a private corporation that at any moment could call a private security firm on you for not being on the park. It also means that that park may be subject to rules that other parks are not subject to, which would inhibit people's ability to utilize that park in very normal ways, like having birthday parties, barbecues. Building community gardens, for example, also becomes a barrier. And we see already when we work with young folks, we work with a lot of teens, and when we work with young folks in the neighborhood, we see already the impact that that's happening on young people. And one way that we're able to literally map that with them is to ask them how they got from one point of the neighborhood to another before a building was built and then after. And what we're finding as we're looking at those maps that they're making is that they avoid all of those points because they don't feel safe, they don't feel like they can use that park anymore. Often those parks, the architectural model for a lot of that development is what we can think of as a kind of defensive architecture. So it's like all the entrances are facing an inward courtyard, for example. So you have to go in order to come out, and the back of the building is facing the rest of the neighborhood. So it's also an architectural style which is not very welcoming. Like literally the built environment says you don't belong. So that's an aspect of it too. I think the questions I'm having, the conversations I'm having with people are questions like, what does it look like to rematriate a city? Like what does it look like to return a city to a right ecological relationship to the world around it? What does land back look like in a city? So for those unfamiliar, land back very simply means just returning lands to indigenous peoples who are the traditional stewards of those lands. So what would that look like? What would it look like to invite the Massachusetts tribe, say for example, to come in and consult city planners in a formal way based on generations of ancestral knowledge of that waterway specifically? Because as folks like the ethnobotanist Enrique Salmon remind us, all indigenous knowledge is local knowledge, right? So like, what would it mean to bring in the Massachusetts tribe to consult on those development projects? Could there be solutions embedded in there? And there's, just as a side note, there's a really great book by Tyson Yunkaporta called Sand Talk, How Indigenous Thinking Can Save the World, which is a bit of a cheeky title. But it's actually a really beautiful book that is thinking about climate and sustainability from an indigenous perspective, and is walking through some of those paradigms too. So, are degrowth models possible? Those are all kind of questions too. Like, can you sort of de-densify the city? Here, sprawl is the solution, right? Like around my parents' house, I was explaining this to folks over lunch. Like around my parents' house, when I was a kid, it was all ranch lands and farms and dairy farms, as I said. But starting maybe in the late 90s, early 2000s, the children of the ranchers that operated those farms were no longer interested in doing ag business anymore. And so they began to sell to developers to subdivide those properties. And then we see an escalating effect where like first it's Cabela's, and then it's the Walmart, and then it's like the Kyle Supercenter, and then it's all of those subdivisions that follow suit. So it operates a little bit differently within a city because it's all about density, because the city doesn't want sprawl in that way. But it's still, in the same way, it like defies a logic of, I think maybe this is maybe the best way to say it. The way it was described to me by some city staffers was like, the solution to housing is often seen of as a supply problem. So more and more and more, right? We have all these people that don't have houses, more and more and more, that's our solution. Operates as a capitalist model, right? I'll say maybe just one last point on it. Housing organizers in Boston are moving more and more into land trusts and cooperative models of ownership because, so for those who are unfamiliar, a land trust is a model of cooperative ownership that allows a group of residents to make collective decisions about what happens on properties, but it's also a way to network properties together. So you may have, there's, I worked with an organization called the Boston Neighborhood Community Land Trust, and they have a vision to acquire 30 properties within the next 30 years that would all be part of this collective effort in Dorchester, which is a predominantly black neighborhood, to build collective power around ownership, but also take those properties out of a speculative housing market. Seen as a sort of win-win. But then decisions can be made collectively around like use and do you want, so for example, my part was to facilitate a community engagement project around empty properties, like properties with no structures on them. And to ask folks questions around like, do you want a garden here? Do you want a playscape here? Do you want, do you want a house here? Do you want other things? But you'll find in communities that it doesn't take long for, okay, this is maybe just literally one final thought on it. But I'll say that I was just talking with some city planners about it, and because they're creating a strategic plan, the Boston Planning and Development Agency is creating a strategic plan in East Boston, and they are struggling with community engagement, so they have very little community input, but they're also not explaining to people how planning and zoning happens in the city. So when they are able to gather residents, community members, and they ask them questions like, what do you want to see in your neighborhood in the next 20 years? People say all the things they're going to say. They're going to say, we want gardens, we want schools, we want childcare, we want a hospital. They want all their basic needs met, and that includes leisure and green space, includes trees and food. But what they're not explaining, what the Boston Planning and Development Agency is not explaining to residents, is that they're only concerned with what is applicable in zoning law, which are things like how far should houses be from the sidewalk, not should a garden go here, should there be more schools in this neighborhood, things like that. So all of that information, very depressingly, just gets thrown out. And as you might expect, what happens then is you're creating a pattern of behavior in which residents will see that their input is not valued, and they'll be much less likely to participate. But they are, as Amber said earlier, like they're experts in their experience in that neighborhood. Like people who live in neighborhoods know exactly what neighborhoods need, and they know exactly what neighborhoods want. So.
All right, one more question.
Hello. Oh, hi. I just wanted to first say thank you for starting by acknowledging the student-led movement outside. And when you mentioned land acknowledgement, I was reminded of our positionality here at the university and how, acknowledgement of injustice does not mean repair, but this institution is not even at acknowledgement. So the idea of repair is not even in idea form. And so I was wondering what you do, if these institutions, the form or the shape of their art is racist exclusion, how do you enter those spaces with the shape of your art? And how do you show up in those spaces? And do you have any advice to give students of color for showing up in those spaces with their own art that is connected to consent and the land?
Man, that is a hard question. There's some like, at what point in my life? because it changes, you know. Because of all the other things that make up who I am. I'll say it. This is how I'll say. One thing that we all have to figure out, maybe related to conversations we were having with the panelists, is like, how do you hold on to the integrity of who you are and what you want to do while making compromises and not being compromised? That's the thing, you know? And that's why I was asking about like where I am, you know? Because like at a different, you know, say 6 years ago, okay, here's for example, I work in higher education, okay? It's not pretty. It's not great for people of color in general. But I made concessions around that because 6 years ago I had a kid and I needed a job and I couldn't just float from contract work to contract work because I needed something more stable. Because I'm a first generation student, I don't have anything to fall back on. Like I have to move, so I made certain concessions. Now, 6 years later, I'm asking myself a lot of questions over like, am I still willing to make those compromises, or has making those compromises compromised the integrity of what I'm doing? And slowly the answer is becoming yes. So my position on it now, in this time and space, is, as I said in the talk, right? How can I step into those institutions, take all the resources, and then step out, right? And that's, when I was talking about Boston Housing Support Stations, that's exactly what, that was the position. Okay, you give me $10,000 to make artwork. This is great. I want to take all this money, I want to give it to this mutual aid organization because people are suffering. And then the city said, how is that art? And then I said, let me think about that. And then I said, okay, I'm going to take $10,000, I'm going to give it to this group, and this is why it's art. And then they said, well, who are they? What are their names? Give me the social security numbers. And I said, I can't do that, and I can't even tell you why I can't do that, so let me, you know? And then I went away and I said, okay, let me reformulate my argument. And we went back and forth, and it took me probably about 12 to 15 times of resubmitting my proposal each time in order to identify an argument that was convincing enough to that bureaucracy and that institutional structure that would allow me to do the thing I wanted to do, which is really to just take everything they had and funnel it where I wanted it to go. Answer your question?
Yes.
Okay.